My name is Richard August, and I'll be your host. Our guest is John Marion, Executive Director of Common Cause Rhode Island. Welcome to State of the State.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Mr. Marion, tell our audience something about Common Cause. What's its mission? How many members do you have? Where do you get your funding? How long has it been around?
Sure. So I'll start with how long we've been around. We were actually founded 50 years ago, both as a national organization as well as a Rhode Island state chapter. So about a dozen Rhode Islanders met in the summer of 1970 because a man named John Gardner had put an ad in newspapers in all 50 states saying he wanted to form what he called a people's lobby. So he was a former member of Lyndon Johnson's cabinet who'd resigned in protest and said that he saw lots of groups that were organized around special interests in DC, but nobody was organized for the citizens, for making democracy better. So he created a national common cause, and then people around the country spontaneously decided to form state chapters. And so about, as I said, a dozen people in Rhode Island did that in 1970. We were a part-time organization until the mid-'80s when a man named Phil West became executive director until 2006. Our mission is open, accountable, and ethical government. People refer to us as a good government group. So we work on laws around open government, around ethics in government, around campaign finance and limiting the role of money in politics, around separation of powers, which is sort of a uniquely Rhode Island issue because we didn't have that in our state constitution until 2004, and around all sorts of issues about making a better democracy. So we're going to talk a little today about redistricting and how that would make for a better democracy. We're a membership organization. We have hundreds of members, all 39 cities and towns, and their individual donations are what fund our work. And so we're constantly looking for new members and trying to mobilize our members to ask them to reach out to their legislators and work on behalf of our agenda.
So you're not getting any funding from a PAC or other national special interest?
No, and we're a non-partisan group, so we don't get involved in elections. We don't endorse candidates or anything like that. And so we stay out of electoral politics. As I like to say, we're all about like setting the rules of the game, but we don't actually participate in the game of the election. So we're about making sure people have access to the ballot box, making sure that votes are getting counted correctly, making sure special interest money isn't influencing our politics too much, but we're not trying to influence our elections.
So you're nonpartisan, but would you say you're left-leaning, centrist, or right-leaning?
Yeah, so I think we've been sort of center-left. A lot of our issues, in the last 20 years, our politics have become more polarized. And I think a lot of our issues have been polarized along with it. For instance, the Voting Rights Act, the Federal Voting Rights Act, was reauthorized by the U.S. Senate maybe 15 years ago, and the vote, I think, was 99-0. And now a reauthorization, wouldn't draw a single Republican co-sponsor, let alone get a vote. And so issues around voting rights that used to be sort of centrist have polarized a little bit. I'd like to think open government and ethics in government are still very much middle-of-the-road issues that both political parties believe in, though.
Now, the upcoming census is a critical one for Rhode Island. Our population has hovered around 1 million people ever since the last election and probably before that. And the population of the country has grown. So it's very likely that Rhode Island will lose one of its seats in the House of Representatives. Even more important locally, the census guides the redrawing of the districts in the General Assembly. And Common Cause has created a movement and website known as RedrawRI. Mr. Marion, tell us about this organization.
Sure. Can I back up and speak about the census for a brief second? So we're actually involved in some census outreach. The census is incredibly important, not only for what you said, for having 2 seats in Congress, and if we lose one of those seats in the U.S. House, it would be the first time since 1789 that we'd have only one member of the House of Representatives. But also federal funding. I don't think people understand the magnitude of it. The state budget's about $10 billion, hair under last year. 3.8 billion of that comes from Washington, D.C., based on formula that incorporates census data. So an undercount would be terrible, both for representation, political representation, as well as the fiscal health of the state. Those are tax dollars that people are paying that aren't going to flow back to Rhode Island if people aren't counted. So that's important. But as you said, we're concerned about redistricting. And that's how we actually got involved in census outreaches, because we have, for 40 years, Common Cause has been very interested in how district lines are drawn in Rhode Island. Like most states, they're drawn by the state legislature here. And that, we believe, is a fundamental conflict of interest, because the people with the most at stake in the outcome of drawing the district lines are the people entrusted with the power to do it. So we've proposed something, and you mentioned the campaign, we're calling it Redraw Rhode Island, and the website's redrawri.org. And it's a campaign around an independent redistricting commission that would take the power to draw those districts away from the state legislature. And the first thing we knew we needed to do was just explain to people why it's a problem. I think a lot of people think, well, this is an overwhelmingly Democratic state, and they vote overwhelmingly for Democrats, and they get the overwhelming number of seats. But it's not that simple. One is that Democrats have expanded their majorities using partisan gerrymandering. So Republicans would probably have more seats if it weren't for the gerrymandering. But also they've used it within the party to punish dissidents. And we've seen that going back to the early 80s. There was, as we detail on the website, there was a case in 1982 where the Senate President Rocco Quattrochi drew some districts behind the scenes to punish not only a Republican, Lila Sapensley, who happened to have been one of the people who founded Common Cause 12 years earlier, but also a Democrat, Richard Leach, who's now a Superior Court judge. He put him in the same district. The state ended up spending over $1 million to defend those suits, unsuccessfully. Both state courts and federal courts threw them out as unconstitutional. And to give some perspective, they spent $1 million at a time when the entire budget for the Attorney General's office was $3.4 million. They spent $1 million unsuccessfully defending these seats. So it has cost the state millions and millions of dollars over decades and decades. In multiple occasions, the courts have thrown out the district line. So we think it's time to start over and let the people, not the politicians, draw the lines.
Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. Several years ago, I was interacting with a member of the House in the East Bay. I live in the West Bay, but I was working with him on some legislation, and he said, I don't think I'm going to get reelected. And I said, why not? He said, well, because the speaker and the leadership don't really like me about something I did, and so most of my district lies in another town from where I live. So it's very unlikely I can survive a re-election campaign. And he was right. Incredibly, he was absolutely right. And he was a Democrat, as you say, in a Democrat-controlled state.
Yeah, and we put a lot of energy into making sure people have the ability to vote. But if you determine the outcome of the election before the first vote is cast, what's the point, right? And so one of the problems with partisan gerrymandering is that it's predetermining outcomes. And so you, as the website we built shows, there are different ways to gerrymander districts. There was a case in 2012 where up in Burrville, in 2010, the representative had narrowly beaten somebody. So in between the 2010 and the 2012 election, redistricting had happened. So they moved his opponent out of the district, right? They just carved him out by a couple of 100 yards out of the district. And they ended up moving thousands of people when they only needed to move hundreds of people just so they could move this one guy out of the district. And that's not democratic, small d democratic in our view.
Now, Common Cause has allied itself with Minority Leader Blake Philippi, who is suing his fellow members of the Joint Committee on Legislative Services over Speaker Nicholas Mattiello's refusal to hold open democratic meetings of the committee when making important decisions. And actually, on the day we are taping this program, the front page story in the Providence Journal talks about the fact that this so-called JCLS hasn't met in many, many years. Now, the lawsuit, I think it's fair to say, came about because Speaker Mattiello had ordered an audit of the convention center, and it did not consult the members of the JCLS about that order. So now, Representative Philippi's district number 36 encompasses New Shoreham, where he lives, and sections of Charlestown, South Kingstown, and Westerly. Obviously, Block Island is too small to have its own representative, but is District 36 an example of how the Democratic leadership tried to redistrict a seat out of the Republican camp?
You know, it's tough to tell. You know, I haven't looked at that district specifically. There are measures of sort of how gerrymandered the entire state is, so all 75 House districts. And by one of the measures is called the efficiency gap, another one's called the mean median measure. By both of those measures, the 2012 districts for all 75 House districts are among the most gerrymandered by a Democratic legislature in the United States. So I can't speak to District 36 specifically, but you can try to sort of look at one district and see what they did to either pack Republicans in or
take a Democrat out.
And but the best way to look at it is as a whole, is the state as a whole, and we know that by the best empirical measures out there, they're gerrymandered. And you know, Rhode Island poses unique challenges when it comes to redistricting because we have so much coastline. And it allows them to play some shenanigans. So, you know, in Iowa, it's pretty hard to gerrymander because everything's a square or rectangle.
Yep.
But in Rhode Island, with hundreds of miles of coastline, you can skip over areas of water. So there's this principle in gerrymandering of contiguity where you can't have two pieces of land that aren't connected in the same district. So if you were in Iowa, you couldn't have a district that is part Iowa City and part Des Moines, but nothing in between. But in Rhode Island, you can have something that is part Prudence Island, part of Portsmouth, and part of Bristol. And we have one of those districts. I think it's 67. And even though Prudence Island is controlled by Portsmouth legally, Prudence Island kids go to Portsmouth High School, most of that district is in Bristol. And so you can play more sort of gerrymandering games when you have this much water.
So the RedrawRI website says, and I'm going to quote, while JCLS has many statutory responsibilities, one of the most important is the hiring of an election consultant to redraw the state legislative district maps in response to the census. And that happens every 10 years. Since 1982, the state's redistricting consultant has been a gentleman named Kimball Brace, called the Picasso of gerrymandering on The Daily Show in 2013. Due to gerrymandering of the kind Brace brings to Rhode Island, our state is considered one of the best examples, I put best in quotes, of Democratic Party gerrymandering in the country. Is this why Common Cause has gotten behind this movement for an independent citizens commission to do the redistricting?
Yeah, I mean, the reason we've gotten behind it is we've been at this for 40 years, right? So when I was doing the research on the 1982 gerrymandering, I was in the state archives and they had 15 boxes, banker's boxes, full of paper because there were so many lawsuits over that. And I uncovered actually a 1982 report by Common Cause saying that there was a problem with gerrymandering in Rhode Island. And so we've been at this for years, but we've largely been sort of chasing the legislature saying, this is a gerrymander and that's a gerrymander. But what we wanted to do this time is say, there's an alternative, right? There's another way to do this, which is an independent commission. It's been proven. We've seen states like Arizona and California do this and be very satisfied with the result. And it actually shows that if you allow citizens through an independent commission to draw the districts, they're less likely to get tossed out by a court of law, right? They're better maps, objectively, and they're more likely to be upheld when judges have to look at them. So we've had a history of judges throwing our maps out. Why don't we just fix it so we don't go through this again? Why don't we stop wasting money, stop, create districts that are better for people? And Phil West, who was our executive director for almost 2 decades, recently said, this is the hardest fight of all, right? Because this is just about taking power away from the legislature, the power they care about the most, which is the power to keep themselves in office. And so it's not going to be easy, but that's why we think it's important.
Do you have any idea at this stage of the game as to what the composition of this commission would be, or how would it operate?
So under our proposal, it'll be a 15-member commission. There's a little bit of a complex way of picking them. We actually created an animation on the Redraw Rhode Island website to show this. And this is modeled roughly after what they did in California. But you encourage people to apply. They would apply to the Secretary of State. She would then have one role, well, really 2 roles. One is she would apply some conflict of interest criteria, similar to the Code of Ethics. So if you were a legislator, obviously, or a family member of a legislator, or a business associate of a legislator, or work for a political party, or so forth, you would be pulled out of the pool, right? You wouldn't remain in the pool. But then those who remain in the pool, she would actually, by lottery, pick 6 people, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, 2 unaffiliated voters. And then those 6 would pick the remaining 9 members of the commission. Again, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, 3 unaffiliated. But they'd have to come to some sort of consensus. So you'd have to have at least 1 Democrat, 1 Republican, and 1 unaffiliated vote to pick each of the remaining 6. And so you would use randomness, essentially, to weed out anybody sort of rigging the system. And then you'd use consensus to try to get a group of people who you think could work together to draw these districts. So it's a little bit of a complex system, but we've learned, Common Cause was involved intimately in the creation of the State Ethics Commission and the State Judicial Nominating Commission, which are the state's other 2 independent commissions created by the Constitution. And we've seen the legislature kind of get its nose in the creation of each of those because we haven't been specific enough. Mm-hmm. So here we are very specific about how to do it because we're trying to keep the legislature's nose out of the proverbial tent.
So the 12 members that finally end up on the commission, they would choose from among their members a chairperson.
Yeah, so 15 members would choose a chair, and most importantly, they would choose the consultant who would help them.
Okay.
Right? We wouldn't.
That was my next question.
Yeah, we wouldn't expect these lay people to have the ability to do this. This is very complex work that involves, evaluation of census data and using powerful computers. And so the trick has been that the legislature now hires Mr. Brace, pays him millions of dollars, and then he does their bidding. And so what we would want is we'd want this independent commission to be the ones to do the hiring.
Now, after Governor Raimondo's recent State of the State address, Leader Philippi was the Republican chosen to respond to it. And he said at the time, and I'm going to quote, "To protect the sanctity of our elections, right now, we allow Senate and the House leadership to draw up our Senate and House legislative districts, benefiting those in power at the expense of our right to choose representatives. It's called gerrymandering, and it's done to the extreme here." But I think we kind of touched on this before. What about the old saying that elections have consequences? If the majority of people want to put Democrats in control year after year after year, wouldn't there be a consequence of that electoral decision?
No, so the problem with gerrymandering is it actually makes elections less responsive. So it's hard to see here in Rhode Island because we are so dominated by one political party. But if you look at Wisconsin, a state that's pretty evenly split, right? It's usually 50-50 or 52-48. Yeah, it's a battleground state. But the Republican state legislature in 2011 sort of cemented, they used partisan gerrymandering to cement their majority. And so we have seen wave elections in 2018, for instance, where Democrats won the vast majority of votes, but they didn't win a majority of seats. And that's because that gerrymandering sort of cements a majority in there for the 10 years between the census. And so, so it makes democracy less responsive. And ultimately, that's a travesty because both parties are guilty of it, right? It happens to be the Republicans are more guilty of it because they control more state legislatures. But if in states where Democrats have control, they've been guilty of the practice as well. And so the reason we've supported independent redistricting is ultimately we think it's going to lead to elections really being a more responsive will of the people than they currently are.
Which they should be.
As they should be, yep. Absolutely.
Now, Leader Philippi was asked if the JCLS control of the redistricting process is a concern, and he responded, quoting, "Frankly, if they go hire this guy," meaning Brace, "without a meeting of the JCLS, that will just be another paragraph in our complaint." In other words, referring to the lawsuit he has already before the court. Will Common Cause become a co-plaintiff or file a friend of the court brief if that happens, if Philippi has to add this?
You know, we haven't looked at joining that lawsuit. We don't litigate that often, although we recently have joined as a friend of the court in a couple of cases. But yeah, we would look at it. We have a process where we have a litigation committee and we have to go through these things. So I can't say we would because it's actually not my decision solely to do that. But certainly, there's a lot of merit to Majority Leader or Minority Leader Philippi's complaint about how the JCLS acted. You know, we were the first group to sort of publicly raise our hand and say, listen, that audit of the convention center that was ordered by the speaker was illegal, right? The statute's pretty crystal clear that a majority of the JCLS is required. Maybe not a meeting, but a majority, at least on a signed letter, to authorize that sort of audit. So we'll look, if he amends his complaint to include redistricting, we'd look closely at it because we care so much about this.
Would the how if people go to RedrawRI.org website, is there a way that they can participate or support this movement?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. So there's a bar on there, and if you click on it, it allows you to sign a petition, and we're going to try to gather as many signatures as we can. The most important thing you can do is reach out to your state legislators, your member of the House and your member of the Senate. Find the bill numbers on the website. It's H7260 and S2077. Find those bill numbers that are on the website and reach out to your state legislator and say, this is a priority for me. And you have to do it this year. Because one thing we haven't talked about is what we're proposing is constitutional amendment. And so it's a two-step process. It requires the legislature to put it on the ballot, and then the people have a chance to vote on it. But they can't vote on it if the legislature doesn't put it on the ballot. Redistricting is going to happen next year in 2021, so it has to go on the ballot this year to take effect. And so we need this to happen between now and June. So people need, the most important thing they have to do is reach out to the legislator and ask them to give this a vote.
Now, sometimes people, I think, underestimate the importance of that. Even though your legislator might be a Democrat, as you said, the major concern for most of them, at least, is that they want to get reelected. And so they're very responsive if they find that a number of constituents are calling them about this issue, that they're going to be, well, I better take a thought at this and look at this.
And it doesn't take a lot of people reaching out, right? We're a small state, these districts are small. It doesn't take thousands of people in your district to ask you about something. It takes a handful to get it on their radar. And we know, we've had some support, bipartisan support. These bills are sponsored in the Senate by Senator Oyer of Newport and Representative Knight of Barrington Warren. And we have good sponsors and good co-sponsors from the other party, but we need people to step up and say they want this.
One more thought just came into mind. If this commission is formed, I would assume it's going to be subject to the Open Meetings Act. They're not going to meet.
Oh no, yeah, it's required right in the constitutional language we propose that the meetings are open and so forth. One thing about redistricting is that I think they had 28 meetings in 2011 and 2012. They have a lot of meetings, but it's what happens behind the scenes. And what's most important about this is it takes what happens behind the scenes and it's going to force it to happen in public, because no longer can the legislative leaders sort of pull the strings behind the scenes, because they will no longer control the process.
Very important. And we have a few minutes left. I want to move to another topic for a moment. Your website says, and I'm quoting, "Rhode Islanders deserve a government that operates fairly and transparently. We're advocating for reforms that hold elected officials accountable for their actions and help voters stay informed about the workings of their government." What kind of reforms does Common Cause believe would make government officials more accountable and more transparent? Are there any specific items?
Yeah, so we've made our sort of singular legislative priority redistricting reform this year, but in any given year, I'm up at the Assembly, so my job is to be the paid full-time lobbyist for Common Cause. I'm up there 3 nights a week for the 6 months they're in session, testifying on a whole host of bills. And oftentimes, what we're seeing is attempts to chip away. They're what I call the 3 legs of the stool of sort of open government in Rhode Island. There's the Public Records Law, there's the Open Meetings Law, and then there's a third law, the Administrative Procedures Act. And every year there are efforts to chip away at each of the 3 of those. And so this year there are attempts to make exceptions to the Public Records Law and the Open Meetings Act. And we're up there, usually along with the ACLU and some other groups, trying to fight that. So that's what we mean when we say about sort of making government transparent, are things like that.
Common Cause supports legislation for automatic, and I'm reading right from the website, and portable voter registration. What do you mean by portable voter registration? That's a very interesting term.
Yeah, so just so people know, Rhode Island actually has automatic voter registration now, so that passed, I think, in 2017. And what that means is that when you go to the DMV, it used to be that you were asked a question on the form, do you want to register to vote? Now you're asked the question, do you not want to register to vote? And a little bit of behavioral psychology, behavioral economics says that more people are going to register if they're required to opt out than opt in. And that applies to change of addresses too, which is the most important thing because people forget to update their addresses. Portable means a registration that would follow you. This is far less common. Automatic voter registration is very common in other states. But portable would mean registration that if you moved from community to community, your voter registration would automatically update. But we haven't, there's not a bill on that right now. That's sort of off in the future.
Okay. Well, we want to thank you for joining us. I have a whole bunch of other questions I wanted to get to. We'd like to have you back maybe as we get into this legislative session, see what the progress is on this redistricting, and maybe get people involved because, as Mr. Marion said, it is really important for you to reach out to your state rep or your state senator and express your opinion that this gerrymandering by the parties in power has got to stop, and we need this type of commission. We want to thank you for watching State of the State, and stay tuned for future editions.